And good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Listen, I do appreciate you being with me. I appreciate all the fantastic comments that are being made. Even some detractors, but that's okay. All right. So anyway, I want to get right back into where we are. We are told that the Olivet Discourse is about two different subjects. AD 70, the end of the world. We are told that the parable of the absent master in Matthew 25, 14 and following must be about the end of the current Christian age at the so-called end of time, because after all, a master departed and he went off into a far country, and there he stayed for a long time. And once again, let me point out the inconsistency of those who say, well, in the New Testament, at hand, quickly, shortly, soon, etc., that doesn't mean soon. It doesn't mean imminent, genuinely, because after all, God doesn't tell time like we do. Oh, but now look at this. In Matthew 25, it says he'd be gone a long time. That's 2,000 years. Oh, wait a minute. If at hand doesn't mean soon, then maybe a long time means really shortly. Why not? I mean, if you can turn at hand, quickly, soon, shortly, etc. on their head and make them mean exactly the opposite of what the words indicate, or if you can make them mean nothing, then surely we can say a long time doesn't mean a thing. Once again, the utter inconsistency of the opponents of covenant eschatology is exposed. But back to the issue. Remember, we are told that when Jesus said, but of that day and hour knows no man, he's talking about the end of time. And he is saying no one can know whether it's soon or a long time. Well, that's strange. Matthew 25 would talk about being gone a long time. How could Jesus know that even when he was speaking? Well, because he knew it wasn't supposed to entail what the adversaries say. It was to be in the lifetime of the servants to whom he gave the talents. That's the defining framework for a long time. You know, that generation of servants to whom the gifts were given didn't die, and then 40 generations later the master comes. No, he came back in the lifetime in the generation to whom he had given those gifts. But again, to continue. So this terminology, but of that day and hour knows no man, completely overlooks the work of the revelatory spirit, as I've been sharing with you. And I've shared with you now 1 Peter chapter 4. Here is Peter writing after receiving the inspired, miraculous gift of the Holy Spirit, and that miraculous gift of inspiration was, remember, to guide them, the apostles, into all truth, to teach them about the judgment to come, and teach them about things to come. You would seem, therefore, to be on very firm footing to say whatever Peter said about the timing of the coming of the Lord, the judgment of the living and the dead, would be absolutely, positively true. And yet detractors want to deny it. But I've been sharing with you a contrast that Jesus gave us, Luke chapter 21, verse 8. Answering the apostles' questions in regard to the fall of Jerusalem and the temple, Jesus said, do not be deceived. Many will come after me saying, I am he. And the end is drawn near. Do not be deceived. Do not go after them. So Jesus was very clearly condemning premature declarations of the imminence of the end. You know what that means, don't you? Not only was Jesus talking about others who would say the end is drawn near, if he condemned anyone for making premature declarations, saying the end is drawn near, then he was thereby warning his own apostles not to make premature declarations of the imminence of the end. They were not to know when the end was near until the signs appeared. Matthew 24, 32 and 33. When you see these things, know that it, the day of the Lord, the judgment, is near, even at the door. Okay, Luke 21, verse 8. Condemnation of premature declarations of the imminence of the end. Notice the particular phraseology of the premature declarations of the end. The end of all things, or the end, has drawn near. Prematurely stated, false doctrine. That's false doctrine. Now, watch this. As I pointed out to you yesterday in closing, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17, Peter stated, now remember, he is saying this through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, who is guiding him into all truth concerning this issue. He was guiding him into all truth concerning judgment to come. He was guiding him into all truth concerning things to come. And Peter said, it is time, kairos, the appointed time, for the judgment. Now, unfortunately, as I pointed out yesterday, some translations simply give it, it is time for judgment. That is inaccurate. It is literally the time. Definite article, the time. The kairos, the appointed time. And it is the judgment, to krino. Now, the significance of this, ladies and gentlemen, is incredible. In the Greek, you have what is known as the anaphoric article. According to Daniel Wallace, who is one of the foremost Greek grammarians in the world today, the anaphoric article is by far the preponderant use of the definite article. Okay, what in the world is an anaphoric article? Okay? An anaphoric article, to put this as simply as possible, is this. A speaker or a writer introduces a subject. After introducing that subject, he refers back to that subject by the use of the definite article. Here's what that means. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5, Peter introduced the subject of judgment. The judgment of the living and the dead, the resurrection. And he said Christ was ready, hitoimos, temporally ready, on the point of doing. Now in verse 17, he said that the appointed time for the judgment has come. Well, what judgment has he talked about? The resurrection, the judgment of the living and the dead. At verse 5, folks, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17 is as strong a declaration, inspired of the Holy Spirit, that the time for the resurrection had arrived in the first century as can be found. Now, there are others equally as powerful, but here's the point. Peter said Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. The end of all things, which is the time of the judgment of the living and the dead, had drawn near, and the appointed time for the judgment of the living and the dead had arrived. And now watch this. Please catch the power of this. Go back up to verse 7. The end of all things has drawn near. Do you remember what Jesus said in Luke chapter 21 and verse 8? Sure hope you do. Many false prophets will come saying, in my name, saying, I am he, and the end has drawn near. Here is Peter writing a little over 30 years later, saying, the end of all things has drawn near. Now listen to me. Catch the power of this. Peter uses virtually the identical language in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7 that Jesus condemned in Luke 21 and verse 8. In Luke 21 and verse 8, Jesus condemned the premature declarations that said the end is drawn near. Peter, writing in that same identical generation, said the end of all things has drawn near. Now let me ask you a question, ladies and gentlemen. Was Peter making a premature declaration of the nearness of the end? If he was, then he's a false prophet. We've got a real serious problem here, ladies and gentlemen. If Peter was writing through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and he was, and if the Holy Spirit was guiding him concerning the judgment, and he was, and if the Holy Spirit was guiding him concerning all truth, and he was, and if the Holy Spirit was guiding him concerning things to come, and he was, then since Peter said Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead, since he said the end of all things had drawn near, and don't forget, resurrection is at the time of the end. So here's Peter affirming that the time of the resurrection had drawn near, and then he emphatically said it is the appointed time for the judgment of the living and the dead. How much clearer could language be? And yet, just the other day on Facebook, I've got to tell you, just the other day on Facebook, I had a gentleman say there is no time statement in 1 Peter chapter 4. Well, he's probably the very first person in all of the history of Christianity to make that claim. I mean, it gets back to this, argumentum ad desperatum. The enemies of the truth of covenant eschatology are seemingly willing to make any argument whatsoever, no matter how absurd it is, no matter how desperate it is, no matter how illogical it is. They're willing to distort and pervert the Scriptures and say, oh, this is the true meaning. No time statement here. Nothing to see here. And yet we have Peter using virtually the identical language. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7, to speak of the coming end, he uses end and he uses has drawn near, just like the premature declarations of the end that Jesus condemned in Luke 21 and verse 8 of the false teachers who would say the end has drawn near. Is Luke 21 and verse 8 a time statement? Well, of course it is. Then the statement of 1 Peter 4 verse 7 is a time statement. How can you take identical language and say, oh, well, one's time, the other is spatial? See? You see how ridiculous things get? So, what we have here is through inspiration of the Holy Spirit, the revelatory Spirit, we have the declaration that the time of the return of the absent master of Matthew 25:14 and following, that time for his return after a long time, that time of his return had drawn near. Don't forget, go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and order a copy of my book, Can God Tell Time? I'm sorry I cannot offer free shipping on this. I sell this book for basically cost because I want the information to get out there, okay? So just order the book, and you'll be glad you did. Now, don't forget, tomorrow we will have another video number 3 in our review and response of Mr. Kyle Pope's book, Thinking About AD 70. We will continue our discussion of his claims about whether or not Deuteronomy 32 applied in any way to the events of AD 70. And believe me, you don't want to miss that. So I'll see you on the flip side.